Welcome to Beyond Transcripts, the podcast for educators who want to meet and exceed best practices in transcripts and education management. On this episode of Beyond Transcripts, we're joined again by founder of Transcript Maker, Matt Bass. Matt and I talk about a very important topic for our homeschooling families, motivation. Student motivation may be something that baffles you. One day they're super excited to learn, the next day, not so much. One day a subject's really interesting, the next day they couldn't care less. So motivation is something that's really important to have a better understanding of as parents, but also an understanding that motivation is complex. When your students are really busy, they have a lot going on, it's very normal that their motivation is going to go up and down. So in today's episode, we're talking about what motivation is, why you want to be aware of it, two concepts called intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and a lot of great tips for enhancing motivation in your students. It's really important to remember that everyone is different, motivation goes up and down, but ideally you're going to find some tips that will work for you in helping to enhance your students' motivation as you homeschool. Take a listen. Okay, we are back on the podcast with Matt Bass. How are you today, Matt?
I'm good, Sarah. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Okay, we are talking about motivation today, which I think is always such an interesting topic because motivation is a lot more complex, I think, than people can realize, or they realize it but don't know how to help it. So that's what we're tackling today. Before we give our listeners some tips, let's talk about some of the realities of our homeschool students day to day and why motivation might go up and down.
Sure. Well, I was homeschooled K through 12 myself, me and my brother, and homeschoolers are pretty busy.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be thinking about, especially in the middle grades there. Towards high school, my brother and I started handling more of the work ourselves, but in the middle grades there, the days can be pretty full. Mm-hmm. So you have your usual coursework to get done, whatever curriculum you've chosen. You have those assignments. You have field trips that you might be planning with your kids. You have any activities that the local homeschool group might have going on. If your kids are involved in sports, you have that to plan and to think about. And then as the parent, you need to kind of organize all this and make sure that your kids are getting everything done that they need to and meeting the requirements that your state has set. So it's a lot to think about. Yeah. I mean, there's all these things that as you list that sounds fun, right? The field trips and the activities. And so students' motivation might be high for those, but then they kind of have to sit down and do some of that traditional work and the things that, your state is going to make sure that your students have actually done. And so you might find that certain parts of your day or of your curriculum, your students' motivation is up. They're interested, they're excited, they're doing it, they're not complaining. And then other parts of the day, it's lower, right? Maybe when they have to actually sit down and do the reading or the studying, what feels a little more traditional, their motivation might drop. Yeah. And that's normal. And
Absolutely.
Some of it is going to depend on the personality of your kid. But I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also important to remember too, that for our earlier students, they're developing habits about being students and how they go about their day. And so I think sometimes in the beginning, what looks like lack of motivation might just be that they haven't developed those habits yet. They don't quite understand how to sit down and do the daily assignments or how to fit that in, if you've got some playing time or the field trip, how to then kind of shift modes to get a little more serious and focused. So that's important to remember too, that it might not be a motivation issue. It might be that they just don't have those sort of school habits yet.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So we've already, talked about motivation a little bit, but I think it's important that we define motivation because again, this is, a concept I think we sort of know, but it can be hard to really sort of pinpoint and understand. So motivation is direction and intensity of effort. And those 2 points are really important, both direction and intensity, because, if your child walks down the stairs and sits down at the table where you do your homeschooling, the direction of their effort suggests they're motivated, right? Because they're there, they showed up. But if they don't do anything while they're there, if they complain, there's no intensity of that effort. So they're not necessarily motivated, right? So you need to have both of those pieces. And for us as adults, we can think about that too. If you show up to work, that might suggest that you're motivated. But if you don't do anything while you're there, or you're really struggling to get things done, you don't have the intensity of that effort, well, then you're not so motivated. So I think it's important to remember that there are both of those pieces, because sometimes, you think your kid is motivated. They're showing up. They're sitting there with their book. They look ready to go, but then, they're not really doing it. So they don't have that same intensity of their effort.
Right.
So why do you think we should be sort of, maybe not concerned, but aware of a student's motivation? Why should parents, sort of have this on their radar?
Well, it really has a lot to do with how productive you're going to be, and whether your kids are going to be able to get all the work done that they need to.
Right.
So it's important for them not only getting through school, but also once they're finished with school, as you mentioned, going out into the work world. If you can build the motivation and give them the skills they need to generate their own motivation for things as a student, then they're going to be able to take that into the work world and be successful. Whereas other students who aren't able to make that connection aren't necessarily going to be as successful, because once you're out in the work world, you're not going to have, you'll have a boss most likely, but you're not going to have as much guidance and as much external pressure to get things done. So being able to kind of have that internal motivation is important, and you can help teach that to your kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you're touching on two sort of really important definitions when it comes to motivation. So again, motivation is that direction and intensity of our effort. But then there's this idea of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And this is basically where's the motivation coming from? And so you've already talked about it, but we can describe it a little more clearly. So that intrinsic motivation is really, the motivation is coming from inside of you. It's that passion that your kids have. They're doing something because they're interested, they love it, they're excited to learn, they love seeing their improvement. So that's intrinsic motivation. And then there's that extrinsic motivation. So when we tell our kids, good job, or, they get some sort of reward, or if you're working for money, that's extrinsic motivation. So there's factors outside of us that influence our motivation level. And I think it's important to clarify that in this case, we're not trying to say that intrinsic is good and extrinsic is bad. And I think it's really easy to start labeling it that way, right? That because, I should do everything because I love it, or I want my kids to do things because they love it. I want my kids to only be intrinsically motivated for school. Well, guess what? Motivation is complex, and it's not bad to be extrinsically motivated, right? I think a lot of us, if we didn't have the paycheck, we might not show up to work, right? Hopefully a lot of us really do enjoy what we do, but we're motivated by a paycheck. We're motivated by those bills that we have to pay. So it's not that it's bad to be extrinsically motivated. We just really want to monitor the amount of extrinsic compared to intrinsic motivation that our kids have and that we're fostering in them, especially in an area like school. Because like you said, we're setting the stage for, lifelong habits and them going off into the world and being their own person. And yeah, you probably won't have a boss that hovers over you. You probably don't want a boss that hovers over you. You need to have that intrinsic motivation to do things. So it's really important to, again, understand this idea that yes, we want to foster this intrinsic motivation, this interest in things, this desire to want to improve and do better, but that extrinsic motivation can absolutely have a place, especially when we're trying to help our students develop some of those good habits in the beginning. So again, we don't want to label it one is good and one is bad. It's really being aware that yes, we want to mostly cultivate that intrinsic motivation, but there's a place for extrinsic motivation as well. Can you think back, Matt, to your time as a student, or maybe even recently, sort of this, maybe examples of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, or, maybe your parents kind of fostering one versus the other as you went through your experience?
Yeah, the one that immediately comes to mind, which would definitely be an example of extrinsic motivation, is when we were younger, we would have a chart with a number of chores on it, including, finishing our schoolwork for the day. And when we completed that stuff on time, we got a star on the chart. And if we got a certain number of stars, we could trade those in for some sort of reward, something as simple as going to the park, or something as extravagant as an expensive gift, depending on how many stars we had to turn in. So for me, that worked really well, because I liked seeing right there, here's what I do and here's how it's connected to the reward.
Yep. Exactly.
So
so that's a perfect,
that was one example.
Yeah. Perfect example of how those extrinsic motivations can be utilized in a really good way. And we're going to talk about some tips next, but let's just cover this one. I think a lot of parents look at it as bribing their kids, right? Someone once told me, I like to look at this as incentivizing. I'm like, oh, I love that. You can incentivize, you're not bribing your kids, but you're encouraging them. And like you said, it was exciting to be working towards something. It gives you a visual representation and reminder. And I think all of us have had some experience, whether we experienced it ourselves or went to a friend's house and they had some sort of star chart, or for the parents now, other families are using those. But yeah, those kind of reward charts, star charts, chore charts, whatever you want to call them, that tracking, yes, that's absolutely an extrinsic motivator. But also along with that, you can kind of encourage that intrinsic motivation, which is what we'll talk about next. So let's get into a few more tips for how we can help enhance motivation. And again, we're not saying it only has to be intrinsic, but just in general, how we can help our students increase their motivation. So Matt, what are your thoughts? What are some tips for our listeners?
Well, something else that worked well for me in terms of intrinsic motivation was just being able to dream and kind of set goals for things I wanted to accomplish. Yeah. And giving your child the freedom to do that is a really neat thing. Not, squelching their dreams, which it seems common sense, but there's little ways that you can do it. Just, as we become adults, we get more cynical about things, and it's easy to put down an idea without even realizing it. Yeah. But yeah, for me, when I was a kid, I had dreams about what I wanted to do when I grew up. And, that provided a lot of motivation for me in terms of getting my schoolwork done. Yeah. Because I knew, especially certain subject areas that fit in with that dream. I knew that I would have to complete those. And so that was one way. Yeah. And my folks never squelched my dreams or anything. So I think that's important.
Absolutely. And the research on goal setting does say that part of why goals are helpful is because it does help to enhance your motivation as you see your progress being made, because you know what your path is. You sort of check the box, so to speak, and then you're motivated because you saw your progress and you see how you're getting closer to those goals. So really thinking about where am I trying to go and what am I trying to do and how am I going to get there will absolutely help with motivation.
And I brought up learning styles earlier, but my brother and I were pretty different in the way that we learned. So for me, I liked being organized and having everything set out in front of me and checking off each thing as I went along. That worked really well for me. So my folks were able to accommodate that. For my brother, he really enjoyed being with people when he was studying. He enjoyed doing it as kind of more of a social thing. So for him, he was motivated when there was somebody there with him kind of doing the work together. Yeah. And so we just had different styles that way. So it's important to be able to tune into how your child learns, and that's going to be key for figuring out what motivates them.
Right. And I would also imagine with your brother, having someone there when he learns, but also to go back to this idea of extrinsic motivation of, saying something like, okay, well, when all of your assignments are done, then you and your friend can go play outside. Or if he was studying solo, then you can, get together with your friends, of kind of using that as the reward to get the behavior done and really tapping into who he is as a person and what he finds motivating.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because one reward it's not one size fits all when it comes to, that reward or that incentive. You really do have to think about what your child will like. And you mentioned this earlier that, when we say you're rewarding, you don't have to buy them an iPhone. We're not talking, big expensive things. It could be something like, you let your child paint their nails a fun color when, usually you wouldn't do that. Or, if there's a Friday meal, they get to pick it. Or, you do a favorite dessert over the weekend, when maybe you don't usually do things like that. So these bigger picture rewards of using something like a star chart don't have to be big and extravagant. You could put together a jar of different types of activities, go to the park, go ice skating, get some fun hair dye, that's temporary and washes out, again, know your kids and know what would work, but you don't have to think big and expensive and extravagant when you are coming up with some of these ideas like chore charts.
Right. The motivation is more about achieving something and earning a reward, not necessarily the size of the reward.
Yes, exactly. And then an important piece along with that is that as your child is working towards earning that reward, you're helping to kind of enhance the intrinsic piece of it and point out the intrinsic piece of wow, look how much effort you're giving. That's great. Wow, I can tell how hard you worked on that particular assignment. Look how much more quickly you got through today's math assignment than last week. Wow, I really can tell that you're learning these things. Wasn't that so much fun to, do whatever assignment we just did? So you can enhance the intrinsic motivation and point that out along the way to working towards, the reward. And part of what we're talking about here is that they're working towards something, right? We're not saying, if you do an assignment, I'll give you a jelly bean, right? Like people do when they're trying to potty train their kid, like every time you pee, here's your piece of candy. And then you eventually you taper that off, and then hopefully they go to the bathroom on their own. So we're not saying reward every single thing that they do, but set them up so that it's a bit more of these long-term habits. You're encouraging the extrinsic motivation along the way. And then kind of that external reward, which doesn't have to be huge, kind of solidifies all of that. And then at the end, you can say, wow, look at how much effort you put in. And, don't you feel good about, whatever it is that they were working on?
Yeah, absolutely. And as your kids get older too, I know it was helpful for me, but when my folks started explaining why they were doing those things, and kind of giving more of a long-term vision for, if you do the right thing now, you're going to reap rewards later in life too. So helping build that vision can be very important as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Parents, I think, have a lot of, we have a lot of sort of control in the beginning of with our kids. And that as they get older, it's important to pass that on to them and explain to them kind of why things are happening or the choices that they're making. But I think especially when they're younger, this is something that can help with motivation, is giving kids a sense of control when they don't have it. And you don't really want them to have a lot, but you give them choices. Do you want to do your math or your reading first? Right? Either way, they have to pick one. So you're still in charge, but you're giving them control. Older kids will figure that out. They will eventually understand, like, Mom, you're controlling the situation here. But for the younger kids, I think that can work well. When they feel like they have control or a say in things, their motivation is likely to go up. So as parents who are homeschooling, you have the ability to do that. Whereas in a traditional classroom, it's here's the schedule, here's what's happening. But at home, you can say, do you want to do this or that first? If you know that your child has less energy in the morning, let's say, they may not be as motivated. Sometimes energy and motivation can kind of get mixed and mingled together. But if they don't have energy, it will be hard to have that intensity for what they're doing. So you can start your day a little later, perhaps, or shift the order of activities. So that flexibility, I think, is really important with a homeschool family in general, but also when it comes to motivation.
Yeah, that's true. And that's an interesting example about getting to choose between assignments, because that was another learning opportunity for me, because, my folks encouraged me to try it both ways. Do what you really want to do first, and then the thing you don't want to do later, and then swap them. Try doing the thing you don't want to do first and see which way you like better. And that's another interesting lesson. I think most generally people prefer to do the hard stuff first, get that out of the way.
Yeah.
But that is not true for everyone. But that's another area where the unique preferences of your child can shine.
Yeah. And I think through all of this, it's just really important to remember a couple things. One, each person really is so unique, and what motivates you may not be the things that motivate your child. And what motivates them one day will not motivate them the next. I think as parents, you already know that, right? Because you're like, but this worked yesterday, or you were interested in this thing yesterday and now you're not. I don't understand. So kids especially, they're changing, they're evolving. So just remembering that they're not going to be the same as you. Their motivation is going to go up and down, and that motivation is complex. So, because they aren't motivated today, don't panic. Tomorrow might be fine. Maybe they just didn't get enough sleep last night. And so they're not really interested in the assignment, or, the thing that they loved, they seem to be not interested in. Motivation goes up and down, and it changes and it evolves, and it is very complex. So I think as parents, don't feel like you have to control it all, right? Or don't feel like, oh no, my child is lacking motivation, I need to do something. Try your best, but your child's probably going to come back around. So before we finish up today, any kind of final thoughts or reminders for our listeners when it comes to helping motivate your student?
Really just to be patient. Be patient along the way. Don't get too stressed out if your kid is having trouble with these concepts. If he's having trouble getting motivated, I mean, remember, even as adults with jobs, we all struggle with this.
Yes.
So what's important is to teach the skills, not necessarily to make sure that the habit is 100% consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, sometimes we get so caught up in but you have to get this assignment done, or, we need to be meeting these standards. And yes, you do, that is important, but also those things will likely, they will likely happen. And it's okay if it doesn't happen today. If it takes a little bit longer, that's okay. But you're helping your student develop good lifelong habits. And like you said, even as adults, we're not perfect with those habits, and we all have our off days. So I think those are really good reminders. So thanks, Matt. Hopefully we've shared some helpful tips for our listeners today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sarah.
Hopefully you now have some more insight into a complicated topic. Motivation goes up and down, and it can change from day to day, even hour to hour, or minute to minute, as you might have seen in some of your students. But that's okay. You're now armed with some tips to help enhance your students' motivation. And if you'd like some more ideas sent to you, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. And if you need some help with your transcripts, we do have a 2-week free trial of Transcript Maker, so don't forget to check that out.